If you enjoy unusual stories, you've come to the right place.
Life inside schools, workplaces, and families often hides stories that seem ordinary at first, but later reveal themselves as dark and unsettling. Behind the classrooms, the offices, and the homes are people who once caused pain, mocked weakness, or abused power, but life rarely allows cruelty to go unanswered. Sometimes, punishment comes not from rules or justice systems, but from the cruel hand of fate itself. At one elementary school, a mother tried to destroy the career of a teacher. Her daughter accused the teacher of physical abuse, showed bruises, and later admitted she had faked the injuries. The teacher's name should have been cleared then, but the mother refused to back down. She pursued a lawsuit, dragged the teacher through hearings, and made life unbearable. Months later, everything shifted. The same girl went shopping with her grandfather, then returned home to find her mother murdered. Her ex-convict father had been waiting at the house and killed her in a rage. That girl, who had bullied others relentlessly, returned to school wrapped in sympathy. Teachers and classmates offered comfort, while some of her former victims quietly noticed cracks in her armor, vulnerabilities they might exploit. A school year ended soon after, and she moved on to middle school. Nobody really knew what happened to her after that. Cruelty repeated itself in different forms. A boy, beginning his freshman year of high school, found himself relentlessly bullied by a larger, older junior. He was shoved into lockers, mocked in front of others, and isolated from friendships by fear. Teachers and staff were told, but their interventions amounted to empty words. The torment was so bad he considered leaving school entirely. Then one morning, the principal announced the bully had died in a car accident. The freshman sat stunned. He did not feel joy, he did not feel revenge, he simply felt the absence of terror. The halls were suddenly free to walk through. Friends appeared, grades rose, life opened up in ways that had once seemed impossible. Adulthood provided no less brutal turns. A coworker who treated everyone with sarcasm and cruelty, petty, childish, unhelpful, was suddenly diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. At first she continued working, but soon her absences grew longer. Gossip turned to silence when it became clear her time was running out. She disappeared from the office completely, spending her final days with family. The same person who once made daily life miserable was consumed by illness, leaving behind confusion and unease in those who remembered her behavior. Patterns like this seem to echo across lives. A woman left her husband for another man, a man plagued by addiction. They had children, built a fragile life, and tried to convince themselves things would get better. They didn't. Years later, he overdosed, leaving her a widow and her family broken. The collapse happened in full view of neighbors, friends, and social media posts that spread every painful detail. Cruelty wasn't limited to adults. In one school, a girl bullied classmates with relentless malice. The truth came out only after her appendix ruptured, forcing an emergency surgery. Doctors found evidence of long-term abuse, bruises, scars, injuries hidden beneath her clothes. Both parents were arrested, and the mask slipped. Her bullying had been a mirror of the violence she lived with at home. Teachers themselves were not immune to consequence. One kindergarten teacher tied children to chairs, gagged them when they talked too much, and terrorized her students. Complaints had been filed, but instead of facing prosecution, she was transferred to another school. Years later, tragedy struck. Driving her 2 grandchildren, she was hit by a drunk driver. The children died. She survived physically, but after a coma and months of recovery, she collapsed mentally. Depression consumed her, and she was eventually institutionalized. The same woman who once laughed while silencing children now lived locked inside her own silence. High school glory also crumbled under fate's weight. A quarterback celebrated, admired, destined for college scholarships, suffered a catastrophic leg injury during his senior year. Scholarships vanished overnight. His dream was gone. Years later, he divorced, spiraled into incoherent online rants, and showed every sign of mental collapse. The star who had once stood at the center of every Friday night now stood alone, unraveling in public. Friends, too, fell to their demons. One classmate, bright and full of energy in high school, returned from military service broken. Drug-induced psychosis, alcohol abuse, paranoid delusions, his life became a cycle of collapse. Eventually, he was hospitalized. The person they had known was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Even divorce carried echoes of these patterns. A woman left her husband and lived with a family friend during long, bitter negotiations over alimony. After months of conflict, they signed an agreement. Days later, the friend died suddenly of a stroke. Suspicions swirled, accusations rose, but no answers ever came. Teenagers carried their own scars. A girl notorious for cruelty in secondary school grew up in a home scarred by grief. Siblings lost to miscarriage, a father who abandoned her, a stepfather who died of cancer. Her anger at school was cruel, but it was also grief hidden beneath sharp edges. Sometimes fate cut deeper. A coworker known for mocking and mistreating others became pregnant, but days before her due date, the baby died inside her, a blood clot in the umbilical cord. She went through labor and delivery but left the hospital with empty arms. Even the homeless, often overlooked, often dismissed, met cruel ends. One man, infamous for yelling at emergency responders and lashing out at those trying to help him, was struck by a truck and dragged for blocks. He died from his injuries despite desperate attempts to save him. High school memories returned again. A bully, remembered only for his cruelty, was later revealed to have lived in a home filled with abuse. His father faced serious charges, and suddenly the way others remembered him shifted. Cruelty had been learned, not invented. Some stories carried quiet devastation. A girl named Paula, who moved away, was later paralyzed from the neck down after an ATV accident. Her parents never visited her in the hospital. Her silence spoke volumes. Relationships carried shadows too. One partner verbally shredded the other, draining confidence and deepening depression until the relationship finally broke. Recovery took years. Teachers once despised succumbed to cancer, dying alone. Students who bullied lost siblings in accidents but returned to school unchanged, repeating their cruelty. People who once tormented others discovered their parents were terminally ill and their bravado cracked. Again and again, lives turned sharply. Accidents, illnesses, deaths, broken families. Every story whispered the same lesson: those who cause pain do not walk untouched. Whether through justice, tragedy, or the raw hand of fate, the reckoning always arrives. Fate did not strike only in sudden accidents. Sometimes the unraveling came slowly, like a rope fraying strand by strand. One high school teacher, known for his strictness and lack of empathy, was shuffled from one school to another after years of complaints. He was never formally punished. Students remembered him as cold, unapproachable, and dismissive of their struggles. Years later, word spread that he had passed away from cancer. The same man who once seemed untouchable died quietly, his name resurfacing only in the hushed conversations of former students. Some felt pity, others admitted they felt nothing at all. Not every tragedy involved death. Some were worse, slow declines that erased people's dignity piece by piece. A man who once set an apartment on fire in anger ended up behind bars. In prison, he clashed with guards and inmates alike, his temper never softening. One day, after being pepper-sprayed repeatedly by an officer, he collapsed and died in custody. His death sparked debate, protests, and arguments over excessive force. For those who remembered the apartment fire, it was the last chapter in a life of destruction. In another school, two students chased a ball into thick bushes. They disturbed a hornet's nest. The insects swarmed, stinging them dozens of times. One boy hit hardest in his groin. The incident spread through the halls in whispers and laughter, but the memory of that pain lingered far longer for those boys. There was also the girl who bullied mercilessly through elementary and middle school. Her death came unexpectedly after a simple tonsillectomy. At home, an incision opened and she bled out before help arrived. Shock ran through the student body. Nobody had wished for this. Even those who once feared her felt a strange mix of sorrow and disbelief. Teachers, too, faced grief. One Spanish teacher lost her husband to drowning. At the very moment she staggered under the weight of loss, students mocked her in class. They laughed while she fought tears. The cruelty left scars deeper than the grief itself. She taught with a broken heart, never fully recovering from that day. Some wounds were invisible but no less devastating. A teacher who had immigrated from a war-torn region carried PTSD. When students staged a mock air raid as a prank, the sound and chaos triggered flashbacks. She collapsed in panic, her body shaking, her mind dragged back to bombings from her past. The prank that seemed funny to teenagers revealed a truth: scars of war never fade. Loss repeated itself in the most intimate forms. A woman gave birth to a child who could not live, born with a fatal cranial defect. She held her baby as life slipped away, experiencing motherhood and grief in the same moment. The cycle of cruelty and consequence continued in small communities where memories stretched across years. One boy placed in a special education class for autism spectrum traits became a target on the school bus. Older boys restrained him, mocked him, screamed at him. Detentions meant nothing, the abuse continued. Years later, one of those tormentors returned, ragged and broken, begging for help. His name was Jake. He had fallen apart, jobless, desperate. The community, including the boy he once abused, reached out with compassion. Slowly, Jake rebuilt his life. The boy who had been the victim felt torn, compassion mixed with the memory of pain. Some wounds never close completely. Encounters years later often forced reflection. A man who had once been hated with a burning intensity appeared again, only this time homeless, weathered, and fragile. The hatred melted into something else, pity, or perhaps the realization that revenge had already been carried out by life itself. Communities stepped in to help, and the question of mercy lingered in the air. Not every tragedy was as obvious as abuse or illness. Sometimes it was a string of quiet misfortunes that eroded lives. Relationships collapsed, mental health deteriorated. People who once seemed untouchable were revealed to be fragile. A once confident peer unraveled after breakups and failures, showing that arrogance often hides insecurity. Again and again, patterns emerged. People who caused pain found pain waiting for them down the road. Bullies discovered broken homes. Abusive teachers faced crushing accidents. Cold coworkers were consumed by illness. Those who laughed at weakness became weak themselves. Each story carried its own complexity. Some deserved pity, some did not. Some left former victims conflicted, torn between relief, guilt, and confusion. But together they painted a haunting truth: cruelty always circles back. It may not be swift, it may not be clean, but it arrives in a hospital room, in a prison cell, on a dark stretch of road, in the silence of an empty home. For the children who were mocked, for the employees who endured hostile coworkers, for the partners who lived through betrayal, the news of what became of their tormentors brought mixed emotions. There was no satisfaction in it, no victory, just the reminder that nobody escapes the weight of their choices or the merciless hand of fate. The stories continued, spilling across generations and communities, a cycle of hurt and consequence, of pain delivered and pain returned. To some it felt like justice, to others only tragedy, but to everyone who witnessed it carried the same lesson: nothing done in cruelty remains untouched. Sometimes the most haunting stories were not the loud ones, but the quiet unravelings that nobody expected. A woman who had mocked her ex-husband relentlessly during their divorce eventually found herself abandoned by the very people she thought would stand by her. Friends drifted away, tired of her bitterness, until she was left almost entirely alone. Then, years later, she watched helplessly as her second marriage crumbled under the weight of addiction and financial ruin. Every cruel word she once spoke seemed to echo back at her, only now with no one left to silence the sound. Others carried the weight of guilt long after the original wound had healed. A man who was mercilessly bullied in high school developed depression so severe that it followed him well into adulthood. Years later, he learned that his bully's parent had been diagnosed with terminal cancer during those same years. The knowledge complicated his memories. The bully had still been cruel, but now the cruelty was colored by a hidden suffering at home. It did not excuse the pain, but it added a layer of grief that never truly faded. Sometimes betrayal played out in the open, in circles of friends and relationships. A dating relationship collapsed after one partner cheated. The betrayal spread through the friend group, dragging reputations into the mud and isolating the one who had been faithful. But years later, the unfaithful partner found themselves betrayed in the same way. Friends whispered, stories repeated, and the pain once inflicted returned full circle. In darker corners of life, cruelty intertwined with tragedy in ways too brutal to ignore. A man once infamous for violent outbursts, who had burned down an apartment during a fit of rage, met his end in prison after excessive pepper spray left him unresponsive. His death became a talking point for activists, a scandal for the prison, and a grim reminder to those who remembered his past violence. Even ordinary moments became grim turning points. Two boys in gym class chased a stray ball into the bushes, disturbing a hornet's nest. They were swarmed and stung dozens of times, one collapsing in pain as classmates screamed for help. Though both survived, the memory of it carried through the halls as one of those strange, haunting moments that schools never forget. Tragedy struck in even crueler ways. A girl notorious for tormenting classmates went through a simple surgery, a tonsillectomy, and never came back to school. At home, a blood vessel burst and she bled to death before help could arrive. Her death left classmates speechless. Nobody had wished for it, not even her victims. The cruelest irony was that her young life ended not through punishment or retribution, but through a routine medical procedure gone horribly wrong. Teachers were not spared. A Spanish teacher grieving the sudden drowning of her husband tried to carry on with her classes, but when her students mocked her, laughing while she fought tears, the humiliation deepened her loss. She never truly recovered, and for those who witnessed it, the memory was as much about their own cruelty as it was about her grief. Another teacher, an immigrant who had survived bombings in her homeland, was undone by a prank. Students staged a fake air raid drill, thinking it would be funny. The sounds triggered her PTSD, collapsing her to the floor in terror. The prank revealed the hidden cost of war and left her students with a guilt that lingered long after graduation. Life's cruelty often took its sharpest edge in family. An ex-wife gave birth to a child with a fatal cranial condition. She held her baby as it gasped for its final breaths. For her, motherhood began and ended in the same hour. There were moments when aggressors returned years later, broken and unrecognizable. Jake, once the tormentor of a special needs student, came back to the same community years later, disheveled and desperate for guidance. The student he once abused was now grown, carrying scars of the past. Compassion clashed with resentment. Helping Jake rebuild his life felt like both mercy and betrayal of memory. Over time, Jake found stability, but for the one who once suffered, the scars remained. Encounters with old enemies forced reckoning. People who had once been hated were found again, homeless and broken, standing on street corners with signs, their faces marked by time. Hatred seemed pointless in those moments. Life had already delivered judgment. Others fell apart in quieter ways. Former coworkers who thrived on making others miserable eventually faced heartbreak, illness, and breakdowns that left them shadows of who they once were. Arrogance faded into depression, and cruelty dissolved into silence. Again and again, the cycle returned. The cruel became vulnerable, the strong became weak, the untouchable became broken. Each story brought the same lesson, whispered again and again: nobody walks away unscarred. For those who once suffered under them, hearing these stories brought no joy, only reflection, only the complicated feeling of watching fate do what people could not. There were stories that haunted entire communities, becoming cautionary tales whispered for years. In one neighborhood, a teenage boy who mocked others relentlessly for their looks and weight later suffered an accident that left him permanently disfigured. The irony was cruel. The very things he once used to wound others became the features he now carried. His former classmates did not celebrate, but they could not ignore the brutal symmetry of it. In another town, a girl who had mocked her peers' financial struggles went on to marry into money. For a while she posted smiling photos, designer bags slung over her arm, vacations in the Caribbean. Then came the scandal, her husband arrested for fraud, her home seized, her accounts frozen. The same people she once humiliated now watched her line up at the same discount stores she used to ridicule. Some pitied her. Others remembered too clearly the words she had thrown like knives. Workplaces had their own stories. A manager notorious for belittling staff, who mocked every mistake and pushed people until they broke down in tears, suddenly found himself on the receiving end. Accusations of harassment, complaints filed, and finally a lawsuit stripped him of the very position he thought untouchable. Years later, coworkers would still speak of it, how the man who seemed invincible collapsed into disgrace almost overnight. Even seemingly small acts of cruelty carried consequences that came years later. A group of kids once cornered a shy boy at recess, forcing him into humiliating dares. They laughed until their stomachs hurt. A decade later, one of those same kids returned to the same town, older, thinner, with eyes hollowed by years of addiction. He begged strangers outside a gas station for spare change, unrecognizable except for the echoes of his past laughter. Not all punishments were visible. Some came in the form of isolation. A woman who had spread gossip with ruthless precision, driving wedges between friends and breaking up relationships, eventually found herself ignored. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. At first, she blamed others, but as years passed, she faced the truth. Her own hunger to control and manipulate had left her with no one willing to stand beside her. Sometimes cruelty lingered in bloodlines. One man who had humiliated his son for years, calling him weak and worthless, later grew old and sick. He needed care, attention, and patience. But his son, scarred from a childhood of constant belittlement, could offer none. The man spent his final years in a nursing facility, alone, staring at the ceiling, realizing too late that his cruelty had built his own prison. Tragedies unfolded on larger scales, too. A group of popular kids once tormented a quiet girl until she transferred schools. Years later, news spread that one of them had been killed in a car accident caused by reckless driving. At the funeral, whispers filled the air, not of celebration, but of reflection. The people who attended could not help but connect the dots, wondering how much pain had been planted, how much had grown, and how it had all ended so suddenly. For others, the reckoning came slowly. A man who thrived on intimidation, who shouted down employees and belittled anyone weaker, eventually found himself working under someone younger, smarter, and far less tolerant. His reign of fear ended not with a confrontation, but with a quiet dismissal. He faded into irrelevance, no longer feared, no longer remembered except as a warning. There were darker twists. A boy who once cornered smaller classmates and beat them for fun was later found shot, the victim of a robbery gone wrong. His old victims struggled to feel sorrow. Some admitted privately that hearing of his fate brought a strange kind of closure. Even love offered no shield. A young woman who toyed with partners, breaking hearts for amusement, was eventually betrayed in the same way. She found herself sobbing in the same restaurants where she once delivered cold dismissals. Friends recalled her arrogance. Now they spoke of her loneliness. And then there were the stories that seemed almost biblical in their symmetry. A man who mocked a coworker for struggling with cancer, whispering jokes behind his back, was later diagnosed himself. The cruelty of fate was undeniable. He lived long enough to feel the sting of his own words echoing in hospital corridors. Again and again, lives circled back on themselves. The strong became weak, the arrogant became humbled, the cruel became vulnerable. For those who once suffered under them, hearing these stories stirred no celebration. There was no joy in tragedy, no satisfaction in death or downfall. What remained was reflection, the recognition that cruelty left its mark not only on victims but on the perpetrators themselves. Sometimes the weight of it returned in obvious ways, through illness, loss, disgrace. Other times it returned in silence, in loneliness, in the absence of love or forgiveness. The thread connecting all these stories was never revenge, it was inevitability. The choices people made, the words spoken, the actions taken had consequences that stretched far beyond what anyone imagined in the moment. Life itself became the reckoning. And the people who had once been hurt were left with the same haunting truth: fate does not forget.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.